Hello, everybody. I'm Bincheng, founder and chief editor of Inclusion Advocate. I'm so honored to be here today to speak with Dr. Jorge Castañeda, former Foreign Minister of Mexico, about minority inclusion, public service, and defending human rights. Dr. Castañeda, welcome to our program.
It's an honor to be here with you.
This month is what the United States designates as its National Hispanic Heritage Month, a chance for more than 60 million people in this country to celebrate their collective and country-specific ethnic origin and ethnic heritage. From this perspective, it's also an opportunity for the entire population to reflect on the progress of minority inclusion. Dr. Castañeda, you've engaged with the United States for more than half a century as a diplomat and as a scholar. What do you think is the most urgent area today for the United States to advance inclusion for its Latina populations?
Well, I think there are two things that have to be done, and I hope that the Biden administration is able to move forward on both fronts. One has to do with in the overall fight against inequality and exclusion in American society, which affects many groups, not just Latinos, certainly, and not just people of color. Within that fight, reducing inequality and rebuilding or building a new American welfare state, which was never really built like in other countries, whether it be in Canada or Australia or Western Europe or Japan or South Korea. That welfare state is now more necessary than ever because American society has changed, because the world economy has changed, and what was perhaps not necessary or not seen as indispensable before is so today. And this has enormous implications for the Latino population in the United States, because it is one of the more victimized sectors of society by this absence of a welfare state and by the absence of social policies, whether it be in education and childcare, healthcare, unemployment insurance, social security, whatever it may be. The Latino population is more affected than other sectors by this overall inequality. That's one front. The other front is, of course, the immigration question, because the Latino population in the United States keeps growing. And it keeps growing because people continue to come from Mexico, from Central America, from Ecuador, from Cuba, from Venezuela, and we could go on like this country by country. And they continue to come to the United States because the situation in their countries is as desperate as it was before, and because the opportunities in the United States are as great as before, or even greater perhaps, in comparison with the opportunities that exist in their countries. So the situation of people in the United States without papers, or those who are on TPS, or those who have green cards but are still the object or were the object of discrimination, for example, during the Trump administration, is that other front. This is why Biden's immigration reform is so important, but also so alarming that it's stuck again in Congress now for the fourth time since the early 2000s, when Bush attempted on 2 occasions to get comprehensive immigration reform passed and failed, and when Obama tried later, and he also failed, and now it looks like President Biden is not going to be much more successful.
Speaking of immigration reform, which was indeed an area of great hope at the start of the Fox administration, which you were part of as foreign minister, the Bush administration, your counterpart, was indeed very receptive of the idea before 9/11. When I was studying immigration policy reform, I read archived news stories about your meetings with General Colin Powell, then Secretary of State of the United States, about the prospect of negotiating an immigration agreement. What was it like negotiating with the Bush administration and then General Colin Powell about this immigration agreement before and after 9/11?
While Colin Powell was, of course, very sympathetic as the son of immigrants himself from Jamaica, President Bush was very receptive from the very beginning. Even before he became president, we had a meeting with President-elect Fox, with then candidate Bush in Dallas. And there we broached the subject very initially, very superficially, but he was very receptive as a governor of Texas and as someone who had very close links through his family to Mexico and to the immigration issue. But Colin Powell was particularly sensitive to this issue, particularly receptive, as I say, first because of his own heritage and his own situation, and secondly because he understood that this was something that was fundamental in the relationship between Mexico and the United States, and that the relationship with Mexico was absolutely a priority for the United States. This is why Bush made his first trip abroad as president to Mexico, and why the first guest invited to the White House state visit was President Fox. It was Bush's doing, but to a great extent, it was Powell's insistence on this and on understanding how important the relationship with Mexico was for the United States. Powell was always willing to listen, willing to talk, willing to read and study these issues, these questions of immigration. And I'm pretty sure that if it hadn't been for 9/11, we would have come up with something. Obviously, we would not have come up with something exactly like what I wanted. It would have had to be the outcome of a negotiation. But I think that this would have been possible. Once 9/11 came along, Powell himself told me several times, look, you're just going to have to wait because right now there's no room for anything else other than 9/11, Al Qaeda, Afghanistan. Then a bit later, of course, Iraq, which, as we all know, turned into a complete disaster. I left office more or less at the time of the invasion of Iraq. And although I continued to follow these matters closely and continued to be in constant touch with President Fox, it was clear to everybody that that was as far as we had gotten.
Let's discuss your public service career in relation to your longstanding commitment to human rights. When you became the Foreign Minister of Mexico in 2000, one of your top priorities was the human rights agenda of the Fox administration. And for our viewers, the election of President Fox in 2000 ended over 70 years of one-party rule by the PRI in Mexico. At the time, international human rights organizations placed tremendous focus and even sometimes pressure on you and President Fox to advance human rights and to investigate the human rights abuses from the PRI era. From your perspective, what impact did all of these international advocacy efforts had on you and other government officials' approach to human rights in Mexico?
Well, I think having a huge impact in Mexico and everywhere in the world. And obviously organizations, NGOs like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, but also the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. We asked then Commissioner Mary Robinson to open an office in Mexico, and she actually signed the papers on the very day that President Fox was inaugurated. She attended the inauguration, and we opened an office there, and that office has remained open to this day. It's been a lasting decision that has had very positive consequences for Mexico, because you have to understand that in countries like mine, and I think like many other similar, the international community's responsibility and agency is fundamental in protecting human rights, in forcing governments to respect human rights and to investigate human rights abuses from the past. Without international pressure, you want to call it that, or scrutiny, it's very difficult for any government, no matter how democratic or how committed it is, to really push forward on these matters, because there's a lot of resistance. There's resistance from the armed forces, there's resistance from politicians who were in power before, there's resistance from the media that didn't cover those abuses before and don't want to be shown up for being complicit. There's resistance from the church. The case of Pope Francis himself, when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires and was up to a point complicit in the human rights violations by the military junta in the late 70s and very early 80s. So there's resistance all over all over the place. And unless you have counter pressures by other sectors, and in particular from abroad, it's very difficult for any government, and it was very difficult for successive Mexican governments to address this issue. So whatever comes from abroad is fundamental. These organizations can be a real pain, a pain in the neck, but that's the way they are, and I think they do an extraordinary job, and they should be supported, they should be financed, and they should be continually present in countries like Mexico.
Dr. Castañeda, in your most recent book, America Through Foreign Eyes, you dedicated a whole chapter on analyzing the dysfunction within the US government today. In this chapter, you also highlighted the fact that almost all Latin American governments copied verbatim the US Constitution and the US political system after their independence. Historically, the operations of these Latin American governments have not been perfect long before the 21st century. Do you think the ineffectiveness of some of these Latin American countries in any way foreshadowed the dysfunction in the US government today? Or do you think that the ineffectiveness in Latin America were mostly due to other reasons?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I think clearly the blueprint from Washington, from the young United States in the early part of the 19th century was not adaptable to the existed in most countries in Latin America. There may have been a couple of exceptions, maybe Chile, maybe Uruguay, but other than those, they were just not adaptable. That blueprint didn't fit because at the end of the day, outside of slavery and outside of the decimation of the Native American population, the 13 colonies, or the inhabitants of the former 13 colonies, were relatively egalitarian. Again, accepting, of course, women, slaves, Native Americans, and later, after 1847, Mexican Americans that became part of the United States, or Mexicans that became part of the United States in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. This was not the case in Latin America. These countries did not even have an egalitarian elite. They were profoundly unequal, and these institutions were designed to work in a society among equals, excluding those who weren't equal, obviously, who were considered not equal. On the other hand, I also think that many of the problems or the challenges that these institutions faced in Latin America were could foretold what would happen one day in the United States when the United States became also a very unequal society, because everybody who was unequal became part of the system, which of course was a huge step forward. But at the same time, it showed once American society became as unequal as it is today, and once everyone was allowed inside the tent, so to speak, then it turns out that those institutions are very complicated in terms of addressing issues of inequality. A presidential system, the separation of powers, the existence of a Senate, the way elections are held, the decentralized nature of elections in the United States that encourages segregation, voter prohibition or diminishment, all of those aspects that the United States is dealing with today are largely a result of this dysfunction or this lack of correspondence between institutions that were designed for a very egalitarian society, excluding everyone that was not included, but are not functional to a highly unequal society like the United States is today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Castañeda, for your insights and for being on our program today. I'd like to close by wishing our viewers good health during this challenging time. Thank you and take care.